On a quiet evening in the suburbs, a black off-duty police officer was driving home after a long shift. Still in partial uniform and carrying his badge and department-issued firearm, he was making his way through familiar streets when flashing blue lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, there was no alarm. He assumed perhaps it was a routine stop, maybe a minor traffic infraction or a check. As a law enforcement officer himself, he understood protocol and prepared to identify himself immediately. But what transpired in the following moments would shatter his perception of solidarity among the badge and expose the deep undercurrents of racial bias that still plague policing, even within its own ranks. The officer, whose name is now central to the civil rights lawsuit, calmly pulled over, placed his hands on the wheel in plain sight, and waited for the approaching officers. From the patrol car behind, two white officers exited, their flashlights already drawn, scanning his vehicle and directing commands with aggressive urgency. When the off-duty officer began to announce his identity, holding up his badge and identifying himself as a member of the force, he expected immediate de-escalation. Instead, their suspicion only seemed to increase. Despite complying fully, he was ordered out of his vehicle at gunpoint, made to step back with his hands up, and forced to the ground. The gun trained on him didn't waver. One of the white officers shouted over his attempts to explain, while the other radioed for backup, describing a suspicious armed suspect. Additional units soon arrived, surrounding the scene with flashing lights and drawn weapons. All the while, the officer remained face down on the pavement, his badge lying just inches from him, ignored and irrelevant in that moment. Eventually, after further chaos and shouting, a supervising officer arrived on the scene, recognized the man on the ground as a fellow officer, and ordered his immediate release. The mood shifted drastically, but the damage had already been done. The off-duty officer had been publicly humiliated, physically restrained, and treated like a dangerous criminal despite identifying himself from the outset. His gun was confiscated, his vehicle searched, and his dignity stripped in front of civilians, bystanders, and peers. In the days that followed, the officer filed a formal complaint, initially expecting the matter to be resolved internally. He believed that once the facts were laid out, that he had identified himself, that he posed no threat, and that he was compliant, the department would address the misconduct appropriately. But the response he received was dismissive. His complaint was downplayed, and suggestions were made that he had not followed protocol, that he may have escalated the situation, or that his identity had not been clearly established. The implications were insulting, and the message was clear: accountability would not come easily. Frustrated by the lack of response and driven by a need to confront the institutional failure head-on, the officer made the difficult decision to file a federal lawsuit against the officers involved and the department itself. He alleged racial profiling, excessive use of force, and violations of his civil rights. In his statement, he pointed not only to the actions of the officers who stopped him but also to the department's culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The lawsuit outlines how the initial stop lacked probable cause, how his identity was dismissed because of his race, and how he was subjected to unnecessary and dangerous force even after presenting clear proof of his position as a fellow officer. The document is filled with painful detail, his hands trembling as he complied with orders, his thoughts drifting to the possibility that he might be shot despite doing everything by the book, and the humiliation he endured lying prone on the pavement, knowing he had done nothing wrong. His legal team argued that had he been white, the interaction would have been drastically different. They cited statistics, internal department reports, and testimonies from other minority officers who had faced similar treatment. The case, while centered on one incident, quickly became a symbol of the broader, systemic issues plaguing modern policing. It revealed how deeply racial bias is embedded in law enforcement, not only in how officers treat civilians but even in how they treat their own colleagues. The officer, once proud of his uniform and the oath he took to serve and protect, now found himself questioning everything. He recalled the training sessions on implicit bias and community engagement, the speeches from leadership on diversity and inclusion. All of it now rang hollow. The very institution he had dedicated himself to had failed him in the most fundamental way. Not just through the actions of two officers, but through its refusal to acknowledge and rectify the harm they caused. As media coverage of the incident grew, public response was swift and divided. Civil rights groups rallied behind the officer, demanding accountability and deeper reform within the department. Community leaders pointed to the incident as yet another example of why trust between law enforcement and communities of color remains fractured. Meanwhile, some within the department closed ranks, portraying the stop as a regrettable but understandable mistake, insisting that race had played no role. For the officer, the case is about more than just personal justice. It's about exposing the reality that black officers often live with a dual burden. Sworn to uphold the law, but constantly vulnerable to the same biases and dangers that affect black civilians. He speaks now with a sobering clarity about the fear he felt despite wearing the badge, about the deep betrayal from his fellow officers, and about the need for meaningful reform that goes beyond diversity quotas and surface-level training. The lawsuit has already prompted internal reviews, though no disciplinary action has been taken against the officers involved as of yet. The case is ongoing, and the outcome remains uncertain. But for the officer at the center of it all, there is no going back to the way things were. His belief in the system has been fundamentally shaken. And through this legal battle, he hopes not just to seek redress for his own mistreatment but to ignite a broader conversation about what it truly means to wear the badge, and who is considered trustworthy in the eyes of the law. Certainly. Here's an expanded version of part 2 of the story. Black police officer pulled over by fellow white cops, then sues them for racial profiling, written in a narrative, journalistic tone and expanded to approximately 1,000 words. As the blue and red lights flashed in his rearview mirror, Officer Jamal Harris instinctively pulled to the side of the road. It was late at night on a deserted stretch of highway just outside of the city. Harris, a 10-year veteran of the force and currently off duty, had just finished a long shift and was driving home in his personal car, a black, late-model BMW with dark-tinted windows. Though he had not been speeding or violating any traffic laws, he complied, assuming there might be some legitimate issue. Two white officers approached his vehicle from either side, flashlights pointed directly at his windows. Harris rolled them down, keeping both hands on the steering wheel, the same way he had trained dozens of young recruits to do during his years in the academy. "Good evening, officers," he said calmly. Before he could finish identifying himself, the officer on the driver's side barked, "License and registration." There was no explanation for the stop, no standard courtesy. The tone was sharp, almost aggressive. Harris informed them he was an off-duty officer and reached slowly for his badge and ID, which were clipped to his wallet in the center console. The moment his hand moved, the flashlight beam intensified and the other officer moved his hand toward his holstered weapon. "Don't move," the second officer shouted. The escalation was swift and unjustified. Harris froze, raising his hands back up. He calmly explained who he was again, this time louder, more firmly. "I'm Officer Jamal Harris with the city's 6th Precinct. I'm off duty. Badge is in the console. I'm just trying to get home." Only then did the officers pause. One asked for backup. The other told Harris to step out of the vehicle. Despite the fact that he had committed no crime and had identified himself as a fellow officer, he was ordered out of the car, frisked, and forced to sit on the curb while they verified his information. Harris watched with disbelief as the officers radioed in, speaking in hushed tones. The humiliation of being treated like a suspect rather than a peer boiled under the surface, but he remained composed. Eventually, a supervising officer arrived, a lieutenant who immediately recognized Harris. There was an awkward silence as the realization settled in. The supervising officer offered a curt apology and dismissed Harris with a vague explanation about standard procedures. But Harris knew better. The encounter left more than just a bitter aftertaste. Over the following days, he replayed it repeatedly in his mind. He had heard similar stories from other black officers before, men and women in uniform treated as criminals when they were out of uniform. Each time, he had shaken his head, disturbed but not shocked. Now it had happened to him, and he couldn't ignore the deeper truth it revealed. To those officers, his skin color had registered before his badge. And that, he knew, was dangerous, not just to him, but to every black person in the city. He filed a complaint with Internal Affairs, but the response was slow and tepid. Weeks passed with no meaningful update. The department said they were looking into the matter, but gave no sign that accountability would follow. Meanwhile, the officers involved continued working their regular shifts. Harris began to feel isolated, even scrutinized by colleagues who once treated him as one of their own. The unspoken code among officers, never turn on your own, seemed to weigh heavily against his actions. But Harris wasn't deterred. With the support of his wife and several community leaders, he decided to pursue legal action. He filed a civil lawsuit against the officers involved and the department itself, citing racial profiling, unlawful detention, and emotional distress. The suit drew immediate media attention, not just because of its implications, but because of who was bringing it forward: a black police officer suing his own department for racist behavior. The backlash was swift. Some within the department accused Harris of betrayal. Anonymous messages were left in his locker. Patrol partners suddenly became unavailable. He was reassigned to administrative duties without clear explanation. Yet, outside the force, support poured in. Civil rights groups rallied around his cause. Citizens who had long distrusted the police pointed to Harris' case as proof of the systemic bias they'd always known existed. In interviews, Harris spoke candidly about the emotional toll. When you wear the badge, you believe it will protect you. But that night, all they saw was a black man in a nice car. That could have ended differently. And it happens to people who don't have a badge to shield them, people who don't survive it. The case became a flashpoint in ongoing conversations about race and policing. Legal analysts noted that it was rare for officers to sue their own department for racial discrimination, and rarer still for those suits to gain traction. Harris' case, however, was unique in its clarity. Body cam footage, obtained through discovery, confirmed that he had done nothing to justify the stop. The video showed the officers referring to Harris' car as suspicious, and one whispering, "He doesn't look like he belongs out here," before the stop even occurred. That evidence was damning. It undermined the department's claims of procedural integrity, and painted a stark picture of bias. Faced with public pressure and the weight of the footage, the city eventually moved to settle the lawsuit out of court. While the terms were confidential, sources close to the case indicated a substantial financial settlement and an agreement to implement new anti-bias training measures for officers. But for Harris, it wasn't about the money. It was about truth and justice. Not just for himself, but for the many others who had experienced worse and had no voice. He returned to duty eventually, but on his own terms. He took a new role as a diversity liaison, helping train officers on racial sensitivity and community engagement. Some questioned his decision to stay in a department that had wronged him. His answer was simple: change doesn't happen from the outside. His lawsuit became a landmark within the department, forcing a long overdue conversation about the ingrained prejudices that even uniforms couldn't hide. And while some colleagues continued to keep their distance, others quietly thanked him for standing up, for speaking out, and for challenging a system that too often protects itself at the expense of the truth.